The coffee pot shattered on the floor of Harlow's diner at 7:43 in the morning, and nobody moved. One gunshot, one masked man, one briefcase sitting on a table like it was worth more than every life in that room, because it was. 34 people dropped to the floor, ducked behind booths, pressed themselves against walls. But the young nurse in the corner booth didn't move at all. She set down her mug. She watched. And 40 seconds later, the gunman was face down on the checkered tile with his arm locked behind his back and his weapon 6 feet away. And the woman holding him there wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't even scared. Then the black SUVs arrived, and the federal agents who rushed through that door didn't come for the gunman. They came straight for her. If this story already has you hooked, follow along until the very end, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift had started the way most of them did at Callaway Regional Medical Center. Short-staffed, loud, and already running 40 minutes behind before the sun came up. Sarah Voss clocked in at 6:15, changed into scrubs in a bathroom stall because the locker room was being used for overflow supply storage again, and walked into the ER with her hair still damp and a granola bar she wouldn't have time to finish. The waiting area already had 9 people. One of them was holding a rag against a cut on his forearm that needed stitches. 2 others looked like they'd been there since last night. She'd been doing this for 3 years at Callaway. Before that, she'd done it in places most of these people couldn't find on a map. The ER bay was controlled chaos. Not the bad kind, just the kind that came with Monday mornings in a mid-sized city hospital that served too large a catchment area with too small a budget. Sarah moved through it the way she always moved through things, quietly, efficiently, without fanfare. She checked in on a post-op patient who'd been bumped from the floor, helped a tech restart a monitor that was throwing false alarms, and caught a medication error in a chart before it became someone's nightmare. "Voss!" The voice came from behind the nurse's station, flat, practiced authority. She turned. Diane Mercer, nursing supervisor, ER division, was standing with a tablet in one hand and an expression that had probably been carved into her face sometime around 2011 and never changed. She was in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed, even in scrubs, and had a particular talent for making every conversation feel like a performance review. "I need to go over last Friday's incident report with you." "Sure." Sarah walked over. "Which one?" "The pediatric patient. Room 7. Sarah remembered. A 7-year-old brought in by a neighbor after her parents weren't reachable. Possible fractures, significant bruising, presentation that didn't match the stated cause. Sarah had flagged it, called the on-call social worker, notified the attending, and documented everything. "What about it?" Mercer set the tablet down and lowered her voice, which was somehow worse than when she raised it. "You escalated without first consulting the attending." "I notified Dr. Hargrove simultaneously. It's in the notes." "You went to social services first." "By 40 seconds. The child had visible." "Sarah." Mercer's jaw tightened. "I'm not debating the clinical call. I'm telling you that your approach alarmed the family, created documentation that may have legal implications, and set off a chain of events that resulted in a formal complaint to patient relations." Sarah stared at her. "A complaint from who? The parents who weren't reachable?" "From the family's representative." Mercer picked up the tablet again, signaling the conversation was over on her terms. "You have a pattern. You act first, consult second. In a real crisis, that recklessness could get someone hurt." The phrase landed with specific weight. In a real crisis. "Understood," Sarah said. She walked back to Bay 3, where the man with the forearm laceration was still waiting, and she started prepping for the suture tray. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing nobody here knew about Sarah Voss. The hands had been steady a long time before Callaway Regional. She'd enlisted at 19, gone through combat medic training at Fort Masson, and deployed twice before she was 24. The first deployment was 8 months in a region she still didn't talk about at parties. The second was 11 months and involved 3 separate incidents that had earned her a citation she kept in a shoebox at the back of her closet. She'd come home, transitioned out, worked 1 year at a VA clinic in Decatur, then applied to Callaway because it was close to her sister and it was a trauma center and she wanted to keep doing the work. Nobody had asked about her military background during the hiring interview. She hadn't brought it up. It felt like a different life. It was a different life. She finished the sutures on the forearm patient, a 40-something carpenter named Lou, who talked the entire time about his daughter's soccer tournament, and sent him to discharge. Then she circled back to the nurse's station to update charts. The ER started moving faster around 7. 2 MV. As came in close together, a slip and fall from a construction site. A woman in respiratory distress who turned out to be having an anxiety attack so severe it had mimicked a cardiac event. Sarah moved through all of it the way she always did, reading the room, prioritizing, not wasting motion. Around 7:20, Mercer appeared at the end of the hallway with the chief nursing officer, a man named Gerald Page, who wore his position like a suit that was slightly too large for him. They were watching her. Sarah noticed and kept working. At 7:30, Mercer stopped her near the supply corridor. "I need you off the floor at end of shift," Mercer said. Sarah looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means your schedule is being adjusted pending a performance review. Starting Thursday, you'll be reassigned to the ambulatory care unit." Ambulatory care? Scheduled appointments, blood pressure checks, and referral coordination. The unit with the most predictable workload in the hospital, and the least of what Sarah was trained to do. On what basis? The pattern I described this morning. I've documented 3 separate instances in the past 90 days where your independent decision-making bypassed established protocol. And the outcomes of those decisions? Mercer's expression didn't flicker. "This isn't a debate, Sarah. You're a competent nurse, but competence without judgment is dangerous in a high-acuity setting. Frankly," she paused, and something in her voice shifted into something almost clinical. "I'm not sure this environment is the right fit for you." Sarah held the pause for a moment, long enough to make it clear she'd heard every word and was choosing her response deliberately. "I'll finish my shift," she said. She finished her shift. At 8:15, she handed off her patients, updated her charts, and walked out of Callaway Regional into a morning that was bright and a little cold, with the kind of flat October light that made everything look slightly more real than it actually was. She drove 3 blocks and parked in front of Harlow's Diner because she needed coffee, and she didn't trust the stuff at the hospital, which tasted like hot sadness. Harlow's had been on this corner since before Sarah was born, all red vinyl booths and laminated menus and a counter that ran the full length of the space. It smelled like bacon and burnt sugar and something indefinably old. She took the corner booth in the back, ordered black coffee and an egg sandwich she probably wouldn't eat half of, pulled out her phone and stared at it without really seeing it. "I'm not sure this environment is the right fit for you." She put the phone face down on the table. The diner was doing its usual Tuesday morning business. A table of retirees near the window. A young mother with a toddler in a high chair, both of them tired. 2 guys in contractor gear taking up the middle of the room. A man in a gray suit at the counter, a briefcase resting against the stool beside him, typing on a phone with the focused urgency of someone who considered every moment of non-productivity a personal failure. The waitress, a teenager with the name tag Bree, brought Sarah's coffee and offered a smile that was genuine enough despite the early hour. "Busy morning?" Bree asked. "Getting there," Sarah said. She'd been sitting there maybe 8 minutes when she noticed the man in the gray suit had stopped typing. He was watching the door. Not the way people watch doors, passively, without real attention. He was watching it the way Sarah had learned to watch things in places where watching things kept you alive. Rigid attention, controlled breathing. The briefcase had moved from beside the stool to between his feet. She noticed this the way she'd been trained to notice things, the way the habit had never fully left her even 3 years into a civilian life. She didn't react to it. She filed it. Then the door opened. The man who came in was average in every deliberate way. Average height, unremarkable jacket, face mostly obscured by a hat pulled low. He moved through the entrance with the relaxed confidence of someone who'd walked into a lot of rooms and knew exactly what he was going to do in this one. He scanned the diner in one pass that looked casual and wasn't. His eyes stopped on the man at the counter. Sarah put her coffee down. The man in the hat reached the counter, sat 2 stools away from the suit, and said something low that Sarah couldn't catch. The suited man's shoulders dropped about half an inch. Relief, or the performance of it? Then the man in the hat reached into his jacket. What came out wasn't what Sarah expected. It wasn't a phone, wasn't a wallet, it was a handgun, and he leveled it at the room with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it before, and his voice came out clear and flat. Nobody moves. Nobody talks. You sit exactly where you are. The diner went from noise to silence in under a second. The coffee pot hit the floor. Bree had dropped it stepping back when the sound was enormous in the sudden quiet, and several people flinched hard. The toddler in the high chair made a small sound, and the mother pulled him against her chest. Sarah didn't move. The man with the gun kept one eye on the room and turned back to the suited man. Slide it over. The briefcase. Right now. The suited man, his name, Sarah would learn later, was Elliot Marsh, didn't move immediately. His jaw was working. He was calculating something. I said right now. Okay. Marsh bent slowly, reached between his feet, and set the briefcase on the counter beside him. His hands were shaking. Sarah was already reading the room the way she'd been trained to read rooms. Distance from her position to the gunman, approximately 22 feet. Positioning. He was angled toward the counter, right side slightly forward. The people between her and him. Two contractor guys who were frozen solid. A woman in a blazer with her hands flat on the table. The young mother pressed against the far wall with her child. She looked at Bree, who was standing behind the counter about 8 feet from the gunman, back against the coffee station, looking like she might faint. Don't, Sarah thought at her. Stay up. Everyone stay down, Sarah said, just loud enough. Not a shout. Calm. Directed. Like she was giving discharge instructions. The gunman's head turned toward her. She was already moving, not running, moving, fast and low and on a diagonal that took her out of the straight line he'd instinctively track. She covered the distance in under 4 seconds, and the gunman was still in the process of redirecting the weapon when she reached him. And then a series of things happened in quick succession that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. She controlled the gun arm first. Not the gun, the arm. She drove his elbow up and out with both hands, used the redirection to rotate his body, and applied pressure at the wrist with a grip that leveraged his own physics against him. The gun came free, without a shot fired. She had it in 2 more seconds, and she set it on the counter behind her, and she had his arm locked behind him, and his face was against the worn formica of the counter, and it had taken, she'd find out later from the diner's security footage, 38 seconds from the moment she stood up. The diner was absolutely silent. The man underneath her arm tried to straighten, and she increased the pressure at his shoulder joint, and he stopped trying. Don't, she said. The toddler started crying. The mother was already soothing him. Someone near the window was breathing in shallow, audible pulls. Panic response, not critical. Sarah noted it and kept her position. Is anyone hurt? She said, loud enough for the room. Silence, then several people shaking their heads. Okay. She looked at the contractors. One of you. Call 911. One of them already had his phone out. Bree was staring at Sarah from behind the counter with an expression that had moved past shock into something that was almost wonder. That was, Bree started. Get away from the counter, Sarah said. Go to the back. Bree went. The man on the counter wasn't struggling anymore. His breathing was fast and tight, and he smelled like cigarette smoke and something synthetic. Adrenaline, maybe, or the kind of cheap cologne people put on when they were nervous. Sarah kept her hold and kept the pressure calibrated, enough to control, not enough to damage. She'd done this on people who were scared and people who were dangerous, and this one was some of both. Elliot Marsh, the suited man, had slid off his stool and put 3 feet between himself and the briefcase. Don't touch that, Sarah said to him without looking. He stopped. Hands where I can see them. He complied. The man pinned to the counter turned his head as much as the position allowed and looked at her from the edge of his peripheral vision. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe 30. There was something in his eyes that wasn't quite desperation, more like the expression of someone who'd run a calculation and found out the math was wrong. You have no idea, he said. His voice was strained but deliberate. Who you just stopped? Sarah kept her hold. I know exactly what I stopped. No. He shook his head slightly, which was all he could manage. You don't. She heard the sirens starting, distant, closing. The contractors had gotten through. She didn't loosen her grip. The toddler had quieted. The woman in the blazer had moved to the floor beside her table, sitting with her knees pulled up, arms around them. The retirees by the window were still in their chairs, frozen in a tableau of shock that would probably fuel their conversations for the next 6 months. The gunman made one more attempt to shift his weight, and Sarah shut it down without thinking, adjusting her position and leverage before he'd completed the movement. "Stop," she said. Just the word. The way she'd said stop to soldiers on litters, to ER patients trying to pull lines, to trainees who were about to make mistakes in training exercises that simulated conditions she'd later survive for real. He stopped. The sirens were close now. Through the front window, Sarah could see the first patrol car pulling up, lights cycling red and white across the diner's front glass. The next thing that happened was the police coming through the door with guns drawn, and Sarah identifying herself, and then the complicated few minutes of 2 officers trying to understand what they were looking at. A woman in scrubs, a disarmed man, a weapon on the counter, and 30-odd civilians who were all trying to explain the same thing at once. She was patient with it. She'd been through the disorientation of aftermath before, the way events that took seconds required much longer to be processed by everyone who'd experienced them. She showed them her hospital ID. She explained calmly what had happened. She pointed to the security camera behind the counter that had recorded all of it. One of the officers, a young guy, couldn't have been more than 23, with the rigid posture of someone still new enough to find the job interesting, was looking at her with an expression that kept cycling between gratitude and suspicion. "Ma'am, I need to ask, do you have any law enforcement or security training?" "I'm a nurse," Sarah said. "Nurses don't typically—" "I need to make sure all these people get checked out," Sarah said. "There's at least one individual showing signs of acute stress response. The woman in the blue blazer by table 4. The officer looked over. The woman in the blazer was now rocking slightly, arms still around her knees. "We have EMTs coming," he said. "Good. Tell them to check her first." He radioed it in without seeming entirely sure why he was following her direction, then turned back to her. "I still need to ask you some questions, ma'am." "I know." Sarah leaned against the counter. "Ask them." For the next 20 minutes, the diner was a contained chaos of law enforcement, arriving EMTs, civilians giving statements, and officers trying to figure out what exactly to do with Elliot Marsh, who had been separated from his briefcase and was now sitting in a booth with 2 officers on either side of him, talking low and fast in a way that suggested he was either negotiating or catastrophizing. Possibly both. The gunman had been cuffed and was in the back of a patrol car. Sarah was standing near the counter when one of the officers, a sergeant named Doyle, older, with the compressed energy of someone who'd been doing this long enough to know when something was off, came over and stood beside her. "We're running your ID," he said. "That's fine. You want to tell me how you did what you did?" Sarah looked at the counter. The coffee pot was still in pieces on the floor. Someone's plate of eggs had slid off a table at some point and landed face down. The diner smelled like cold coffee and anxiety. "I assessed the situation," she said. "I acted when I had a reasonable window." "That's not a normal civilian response." "I know." Doyle studied her for a moment. "You were military." It wasn't quite a question. "I was," Sarah said. "What branch?" "Army." "What role?" She looked at him. "Combat medic." Doyle nodded once slowly, like something had just clicked into place for him. "How long out?" 3 years. He looked at the patrol car through the window where the gunman was sitting, then at the booth where Marsh was still talking at the officers, then back at Sarah. "Something about this whole setup feels wrong to me," he said quietly. "The guy with the briefcase, Marsh, he's saying he's the victim, but his vitals were off the moment we walked in. Nobody's that calm after being held at gunpoint." "He wasn't scared," Sarah said. "He was managing." Doyle looked at her. "What's the difference?" "Fear is involuntary. Managing is a choice." He chewed on that. "You noticed that while you were dealing with the other guy?" "I noticed things." He was about to say something else when his radio crackled. He stepped away to answer it, and Sarah turned back to the counter and looked at the briefcase, which was still sitting where Marsh had put it, with yellow evidence tape now around the perimeter of the counter area. It was a standard aluminum-sided hard case with a combination lock. Nothing about it looked unusual. But the gunman had been willing to walk into a public diner with a weapon in the morning to get it. People didn't take that kind of risk for something ordinary. The officer who'd been questioning her earlier appeared at her elbow. He was looking at his radio with an expression Sarah couldn't immediately categorize. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "we need you to stay put. I wasn't going anywhere." "No, I mean—" He paused. "Something's happening outside." Sarah looked toward the front of the diner. Through the glass, she could see the patrol cars that had been angled across the street, the EMT vehicle, the cluster of civilian onlookers that had accumulated on the sidewalk across the intersection. All of that was normal. What wasn't normal were the black SUVs. 3 of them, then a 4th, pulling in from 2 different directions, moving with the coordinated precision of a choreographed maneuver. They didn't have lights running, but they didn't need them. Every patrol officer outside had stopped moving. One of the EMTs was standing very still with a hand at his side, not on a weapon, just frozen. Inside the diner, the low noise of statements being taken and radios crackling faded almost entirely. Everyone was watching the front windows. The SUVs stopped. Doors opened. The people who got out were dressed in tactical gear, no visible insignia, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that communicated training without announcing it. There were 8 of them. A 9th came out last from the front passenger seat of the lead vehicle. He was dressed differently, not tactical, but clearly in command. Gray jacket, no tie, the quiet authority of someone who didn't need either the gear or the posture to be taken seriously. He was in his mid-40s, with close-cropped gray hair and the compressed, economical way of moving that Sarah recognized from certain kinds of people she'd spent years around. He spoke briefly to one of the patrol officers outside, then came through the door. The diner had been quiet before. Now it was a different kind of quiet. The man in the gray jacket scanned the room exactly once, the same way Sarah had scanned it when the gunman walked in. A full, functional assessment. Not casual, not theatrical. Then his eyes found Sarah at the counter. He walked to her directly. His team positioned themselves near the exits and along the walls without being asked. He stopped about 3 feet away. Looked at her. His expression wasn't warm and it wasn't cold. It was the face of someone who was managing information and choosing precisely how much of it to release. "Sarah Voss," he said. Not a question. Sarah looked at him steadily. "Yeah." "Special Agent Marcus Dre, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Organized Crime Division." He let that settle for exactly 1 second. "Corporal Voss." He paused on the title. "We've been watching this location for 9 days." Sarah said nothing. "The man in the patrol car outside," Dre glanced toward the window, "is not a random criminal. His name is Kevin Garth. He's an operative connected to a trafficking network we've had under investigation for 14 months. Sarah absorbed this. "And Marsh?" Dre's expression changed by approximately nothing, but something behind his eyes shifted. "What made you notice Marsh?" "He wasn't afraid." "No," Dre said. "He wasn't." He looked at her for another moment, then looked at the briefcase on the counter. "The transfer was supposed to happen before we got here. We were 4 minutes out when it went sideways." "When I went sideways," Sarah said. "Yes." She held his gaze. "And you're here to tell me I interfered with a federal operation?" "I'm here," Dre said carefully, "because what's in that briefcase is the reason 14 months of work is either still intact or completely compromised, and that determination depends on whether you and I have a very specific conversation right now." Around them, the diner had gone so quiet that Sarah could hear the refrigeration unit behind the counter cycling. She looked at the briefcase. She looked at the patrol car outside where Kevin Garth was sitting, and at the booth where Elliot Marsh had gone completely still. "Okay," Sarah said. "Let's talk." Dre reached into his jacket and produced a photo, and laid it on the counter in front of her. It was a surveillance image, grainy, slightly compressed, but clear enough. It showed Marsh, with another man, in what appeared to be a hospital corridor. The hospital in the background had its name visible on a wall-mounted directory sign behind them. Sarah looked at it, then looked up at Dre. "That's Callaway Regional," she said. "Yes." The word landed with the flat weight of something that had been expected, something that had been confirmed, something that changed the geometry of everything Sarah thought she'd walked away from that morning. "There's a reason you were watching this location," she said. "There are several reasons," Dre said. "One of them involves you." The refrigeration unit behind the counter cycled off. The diner was completely silent now, and outside, through the front glass, the sun had climbed high enough to throw the shadows of the SUVs long and flat across the pavement, and Sarah Voss stood in the wreckage of what she'd thought was a routine Tuesday morning and understood that nothing about the next few hours was going to be simple. "There are several reasons," Dre said. "One of them involves you." He didn't elaborate on that immediately, which was its own kind of answer. He folded the surveillance photo and put it back inside his jacket, and Sarah watched him do it with the attention she gave to things that mattered, cataloging the gesture, the deliberateness of it, the way he controlled what she saw and when she saw it. He was good at this. She'd met people who were good at this before, in different contexts, different uniforms, and the skill looked the same regardless of which side of a situation they were on. "I need 15 minutes, Dre said, "somewhere quieter than this." Sarah looked around the diner. 2 officers had quietly moved the remaining civilians toward the far end of the room, near the restrooms, away from the counter. Elliot Marsh was still in the booth, and one of Dre's people had taken up a position beside him that made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. Garth was outside in the patrol car. Bree was somewhere in the back, probably sitting on an overturned milk crate, trying to process her morning. "The back booth," Sarah said. It was the one she'd been sitting in when all of this started. The coffee was probably cold by now. They moved there without announcement, and one of Dre's agents, a woman, late 30s, short dark hair, the kind of still expression that came from years of not reacting to things in public, positioned herself at the end of the row without being asked. Dre sat across from Sarah and put his hands flat on the table, which she read as deliberate body language. Not a threat. An opening. "Callaway Regional has been peripheral to this investigation for approximately 8 months, he said. "The network we're tracking, we're calling it Meridian for operational purposes, has been using civilian hospital infrastructure as part of a distribution chain." Distribution of what? Proprietary medical research. Specifically, 3 years of government-funded neuropharmacological data that was reported stolen from a defense contractor's affiliated research arm. The data concerns drug interaction protocols that were being developed for battlefield trauma treatment. Sarah absorbed this. Someone's selling it. Someone's been selling components of it, yes, in pieces to multiple buyers over a period of roughly 22 months. Dre's eyes were steady on hers. The briefcase Garth was trying to collect this morning contains a hard drive with the most recent data package. It was supposed to move today. And Marsh is the seller. Marsh is a courier. Upper tier, but a courier. He works inside the supply chain as a financial intermediary. The actual structure above him is what we've been building toward. Sarah looked at the briefcase, still behind the evidence tape at the counter. Why a diner? Why not somewhere with better cover? Because Marsh insisted on a public location for this specific exchange. He's done it before. It's a security calculation. He believes armed criminal action in a public space draws civilian interference before law enforcement can respond, and that interference gives him cover to abort. Dre paused. He wasn't wrong about the civilian interference. He was wrong about the cover. Yes. She watched him for a moment. He was giving her information in careful, measured installments, and she was aware he was doing it, and she suspected he was aware that she was aware. It was a particular kind of conversation. "You said one of the reasons you're here involves me," Sarah said. "That's not about this morning." "No." Dre looked at the table for the first time since they'd sat down, which felt like the only involuntary thing he'd done. 8 months ago, Meridian's data chain ran through Callaway Regional's pharmacy procurement network. Someone inside the hospital was facilitating the movement of documentation, not the data itself, but the administrative paper trail that helped legitimize transfers. We identified the method. We've been slower identifying the individual. Sarah said nothing, because she knew where this was going, and she needed him to say it himself. 3 months ago, Dre continued, an ER nurse at Callaway filed an internal report flagging irregularities in the hospital's procurement documentation. The report was reviewed by hospital administration, categorized as a clerical concern, and closed without escalation. He looked up. The nurse was you. The granola bar she'd never finished was still in her scrub's pocket. She'd forgotten about it until that moment. I flagged a discrepancy in the controlled substance requisition logs. The quantities didn't match the distribution records. Yes. They told me it was a software update issue. It wasn't. Dre's voice was flat, not unkind, just precise. What you found was the edge of the paper trail we've been mapping for 8 months. You got there independently, with no knowledge of our investigation, using exactly the kind of pattern recognition that most people with institutional access simply don't apply. Sarah sat with that for a moment. 3 months ago, she'd spent 4 evenings cross-referencing pharmacy logs on her own time because something had felt off, and she couldn't let it go. She'd written the report carefully. She'd submitted it through proper channels. She'd been told by a hospital administrator she'd never met before or since that the discrepancy was a known system artifact. She'd been told, in other words, to stop looking. Who closed the report? She asked. Dre reached into his jacket again. This time what he produced wasn't a photo. It was a folded document, a single printed page, which he set on the table and turned so she could read it. The name at the bottom of the report closure was Gerald Page, Chief Nursing Officer. Sarah looked at it for a long time. The morning light coming through the small window at the back of the diner was the flat, specific gray of early October, and it fell across the document and made the printed name look very clear and very still. How long have you known? She asked. That Page was involved? 4 weeks. That his involvement extends beyond the administrative side, so we're still building that picture. Dre took the document back. This morning was supposed to give us the final link between Marsh and the network's primary coordinator, Garth collecting that briefcase, in this location, with Marsh as the handoff. It was the transaction we needed documented. And I stopped it. You stopped Garth from leaving with the briefcase, which means the exchange is incomplete, which means... He stopped. Which means Marsh can argue he was the victim of an attempted robbery and the transaction never happened, Sarah finished. Dre looked at her. Yes. But you have Garth. We have Garth, who, as of this morning, has said nothing beyond confirming his name. Sarah leaned back. The vinyl of the booth was cold through her scrubs. Outside, she could hear the low frequency of radio communication, the irregular sound of civilian vehicles slowing to look at the scene, the particular ambient texture of a situation that hadn't resolved yet. You need what's on the drive, she said. We need what's on the drive, and we need to be able to use it, which requires establishing the chain of custody in a way that doesn't hand Marsh's defense attorney a procedural argument. I touched the briefcase. You told Marsh not to touch it, and you didn't open it. That's actually, in a complicated way, better for us than the alternative. Dre folded his hands on the table. You're not a federal agent. You have no official capacity in this investigation. You're a nurse who disarmed a man in a diner and preserved the scene. The lawyers can work with that. Sarah looked at him steadily. What do you need from me? A full statement. Everything you noticed about Marsh before Garth came in. Everything Garth said, the exact sequence of events, anything that was communicated between them. He said slide it over, the briefcase, right now. Marsh said okay and complied. The only other thing Garth said directly to me was when I had him down. He said, you have no idea who you just stopped. Dre went still. Say that again. He said, you have no idea who you just stopped. I told him I knew exactly what I stopped. He said, no, you don't. Dre looked at the agent at the end of the row. A look passed between them that had the weight of something significant, though Sarah couldn't read the specifics of it. That's not the kind of thing a courier says, Dre said, almost to himself. No, Sarah agreed. It's not. The next 40 minutes were procedural. Dre's team moved through the diner with the systematic efficiency of people who'd processed a lot of scenes, photographing, documenting, collecting. The briefcase was packaged and inventoried. Marsh was formally detained and transferred to an FBI vehicle. Sergeant Doyle coordinated with Dre's lead agent on jurisdictional protocols with the resigned professionalism of a local cop who'd been through federal encroachments before and had decided the path of least resistance was the most useful one. Sarah gave her full statement to the female agent. Her name was Foss, which Sarah found faintly symmetrical, and answered every question precisely and without elaboration. She mentioned the pharmacy report. Foss's pen slowed for a moment when she did, and then continued. Through the diner's front window, Sarah watched the patrol car with Garth eventually pull away, followed by two of the FBI vehicles. The remaining SUVs stayed. Dre came back to the diner after 20 minutes outside and looked like he'd been on the phone for all of it. Bree had emerged from the back and was sitting at the end of the counter with a cup of coffee she was holding in both hands. She looked at Sarah with the expression of someone who'd been through something and was still doing the inventory of its effects. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked her. "I dropped the coffee pot," Bree said. "That's a reasonable thing to drop. It was the one thing I was supposed to not do. Keep the pot. Keep moving. That's what my manager always says." She looked at the broken glass that no one had cleaned up yet. "He's going to be upset about the pot." "Your manager wasn't here," Sarah said. "You did fine." Bree looked at her with 17-year-old directness. "You weren't scared at all, were you?" It wasn't exactly an accusation, but it had the edge of one. "I was scared," Sarah said. "You didn't look it." "That's different from not feeling it." Bree absorbed this. "How do you do that?" Sarah didn't answer that one because the honest answer was long and involved a lot of things she hadn't fully sorted out herself, and this wasn't the place for it. She picked up her own coffee, which was completely cold, and drank some of it anyway because she needed the caffeine more than she needed the temperature. Dre reappeared at her elbow. "We need to move you." Sarah set down the mug. "Move me where?" "Field office. Your statement is solid, but there are aspects of this investigation that I'm not going to walk through in a diner." "Am I being detained?" "No." He was direct about it. "You can decline. But what I have to tell you, there are parts of it that you should probably know." Sarah thought about Callaway Regional, about Mercer's flat voice that morning. "I'm not sure this environment is the right fit for you." About the pharmacy report she'd filed 3 months ago, and the administrator who'd patted it shut with a word about software artifacts. "Okay," she said, "let me tell my sister where I'm going." Dre nodded and stepped away to give her the space to make the call, which she noted as a small gesture of something, consideration, or its professional approximation. Her sister, Nora, was in the middle of a school drop-off when she picked up, and Sarah kept it brief. She'd been caught up in something. She'd explain later. No, she was fine. She just needed Nora to know where she was going in case. Nora, who had grown up watching Sarah navigate situations with the same calm she brought to everything else, asked one question. "Are you actually fine, or are you fine?" And Sarah said the second one, and Nora said, "Okay," and hung up. The drive to the field office took 20 minutes. Sarah sat in the back of one of the SUVs and watched the city move past the tinted window. Callaway Regional's main entrance appeared briefly on a cross street as they drove through a light, the hospital's green and gray signage visible for about 3 seconds before the vehicle moved past it. Sarah watched it until it was gone. The field office was in a building that looked like a regional insurance company from the outside, which was probably intentional. Inside, it had the specific atmosphere of federal law enforcement, institutional lighting, too cold air, the low sound of systems running. Dre led her through 2 security checkpoints and into a conference room on the 4th floor that had a long table, a wall of windows overlooking a parking structure, and a whiteboard covered in writing that someone had half erased. He closed the door. The female agent Foss came in and sat at the end of the table with a laptop. "What I'm going to show you is part of an active investigation," Dre said. "Viewing this material doesn't obligate you to anything, but it does mean I'm asking you to hold it in confidence until we authorize disclosure. Can you agree to that?" "Yes," Sarah said. He pulled up a display on a screen at the end of the room. It showed a network diagram, the kind used to map organizational relationships. Names, some real, some designated by code identifiers, connected by lines of different weights and colors. In the center was a node labeled Meridian Core. Branching from it were several chains. One of them led through 3 intermediary nodes to a box labeled with a designation that Dre's team had assigned, Anchor-Hospital-01. Sarah looked at the diagram and already knew. "Callaway Regional," she said. Yes. Dre stood beside the display. The hospital's connection to Meridian isn't through its clinical operations. It's administrative. Specifically, the hospital's procurement and documentation system was being used to generate false paper trails for the movement of licensed medical data between Meridian's buyers and sellers. The documents were generated to look like internal hospital research transfers, which are routine, barely audited, and rarely flagged. And someone inside the hospital was generating them, Sarah said. Someone with administrative access and enough knowledge of the documentation process to make them look clean. Dre clicked to the next slide. We've identified 4 documents in the past 8 months that originated from Callaway's internal system and were used in Meridian transfers. 3 of them cleared through procurement. 1 of them went through the nursing administration portal. Sarah looked at the slide. The nursing administration portal. A system she had access to. A system Diane Mercer had access to. A system Gerald Page had administrator-level access to. When was the last document generated? She asked. 6 weeks ago. She thought about 6 weeks ago. She'd been on nights for most of that stretch. The ER had been running short because of a flu outbreak hitting the staff. She'd picked up extra shifts and barely seen the administrative offices. And Page is the one generating them. Dre was quiet for a beat. We believe Page is the access point. Whether he's operating with full knowledge of what the documents are used for, or whether he's been manipulated into generating them, that's part of what we're still building. What does manipulated look like in this context? Someone with leverage over him, financial, personal? Dre looked at her. We don't know yet. Sarah looked at the network diagram. There was something about it that bothered her. Not the connections themselves, but the shape of the structure, the way the lines distributed. She'd seen organizational charts before, in the military, in hospital administration, in the bureaucratic scaffolding that surrounded every institution. This one had an asymmetry that felt deliberate. The core node, she said. Meridian Core. You've been building toward it for 14 months, and you still have it boxed as unknown? We have a designation for the primary coordinator, Dre said. We don't have an identity. What do you have? He looked at her for a moment, making the calculation of how much to give. Then he clicked to another slide. It showed a communication intercept, redacted, but legible enough. A message string, timestamps spanning 6 months between 2 encrypted addresses. The language was elliptical, coded without being obviously coded. But running through it was a consistent structural pattern, the coordinator giving direction, the receiving party confirming. And in 3 separate messages, a reference to something called the clinical side. Sarah read through it. The clinical side, that's a separate layer. Yes. Someone with actual medical knowledge, not just administrative access. Someone who understands what the data represents, what it's worth, what the application gaps are that make one buyer more valuable than another. Dre said nothing, but his expression confirmed it. You think it's someone at Callaway, Sarah said. We think the coordinator has a direct connection to Callaway's clinical operations. That's as far as we can confirm. Sarah sat back. The conference room was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. She thought about the pharmacy report, about filing it properly, through channels and having it disappear, about Page's name on the closure document, about the 14 months of federal investigation that had been running parallel to her 3 years at Callaway Regional without her having any idea. She thought about Mercer this morning. I'm not sure this environment is the right fit for you. Something shifted in the back of her mind. Not a certainty, not yet, but the shape of a possibility that had just acquired one more edge. This morning, Sarah said, before I came to the diner, Mercer told me I was being reassigned. She cited 3 incidents in the past 90 days where I allegedly bypassed protocol. Yes, Dre said. We're aware of the reassignment. Sarah stared at him. You're aware of the... We've had a monitoring order on Callaway's internal communications for 11 weeks, Foss said from the end of the table, without looking up from the laptop. Internal personnel actions are within scope. Sarah took a breath. The FBI had been watching Callaway's internal communications for 11 weeks, and the morning she got reassigned was the same morning the Meridian transfer was supposed to happen in the diner 3 blocks from the hospital. The timing, she said. Yes, Dre said. We noticed it. You think the reassignment was intentional. Someone inside the hospital moved me off the ER floor this morning specifically. We think it's possible. Because I'd filed the pharmacy report. Because I was the person most likely to notice something wrong. Because you already had once. The room went quiet again. Outside the windows, the parking structure sat in flat October light, and a single crow was walking along the concrete edge of the second level with the unhurried purpose of something that owned the space. Sarah looked at the network diagram still up on the screen. The central node. Meridian core. 14 months of federal work building toward an identity they still didn't have. "Garth," she said, before I had him down. He said, "You have no idea who you just stopped. You said that wasn't a courier's line." "No," Dre agreed. "It's not." What if he didn't mean himself? Dre went very still. "He meant Marsh," Sarah said. "He wasn't saying I'm someone important. He was saying the person you just interfered with, the transaction you just interrupted, that's who matters. Marsh isn't just a courier." She looked at Dre. "Or if he is, he's a courier who knows who he's carrying for." Foss had stopped typing. Dre turned to the screen and looked at the network diagram for a long moment, and then he reached for his phone and dialed without explanation. The call connected immediately. "We need to change the Marsh interrogation approach," he said. "Start with his relationship to the coordinator, not the transactions. The relationship." A pause. "Because I think we've been misreading his position in the structure. Pull everything we have on his communications with the core node and get it to the room before we start." Another pause. "Just do it." He ended the call and turned back to Sarah. She'd been watching him through all of it, and she'd caught the thing that happened in the half-second after he hung up. The compressed, controlled exhale of a man who'd just realized something important might have been sitting in front of him for a while. "You've been treating Marsh as peripheral," she said. "We've been treating Marsh as a known quantity," Dre said, and something in his voice had changed, a fraction more honest, the way people got when they were recalibrating on the fly and didn't have the energy to maintain full presentation. "He's been in the file for 8 months. His role has been assessed. Assessed wrong." Dre didn't argue it. "Possibly." Sarah looked at the diagram again. The lines connecting the nodes, the asymmetry she'd noticed earlier. If Marsh was actually higher in the structure than assessed, that changed the geometry. The lines redistributed, the weight of certain connections became different. She was working through it when Foss said, from the end of the table, "We have a problem." Both Sarah and Dre looked at her. Foss turned the laptop toward them. On the screen was a notification from the monitoring system, Callaway Regional's internal communications. "This was sent 40 minutes ago," Foss said. "Internal memo. From Nursing Administration." Sarah looked at the memo. It was brief. It cited the morning's incident at Harlow's Diner, which someone had evidently been monitoring either through news or some other channel, and noted that an employee of Callaway Regional had been involved in a law enforcement situation downtown. It stated that, pursuant to hospital policy, the employee's access credentials had been suspended pending review of her fitness for duty. The employee named was Sarah Voss. "They moved fast," Sarah said. 11 minutes after the first patrol car arrived at the diner, Foss confirmed. "Who sent it?" Foss looked at the screen. "Sent from Diane Mercer's account, authorized by Gerald Page." Sarah read the memo again. The language was clean and administrative and said nothing directly wrong. A fitness for duty review was a legitimate mechanism. The timing was, if you didn't know what you were looking at, completely explainable by the morning's events. "They're cutting me off," Sarah said. "From the system, from the building." "Yes." "Which means whatever I saw, whatever I might see if I went back in, they're making sure I can't access it." Dre was already on the phone again. Sarah stared at the memo on the screen and felt something she didn't usually let herself feel on the job, which was anger. Not the hot, reactive kind. The specific, cold kind that came from recognizing a pattern she'd been standing in without knowing it. 3 months of being managed, minimized, redirected, and now formally cut off. The morning a federal investigation moved within reach of something real. She'd been a problem they needed to contain, She just hadn't known it. "Agent Dre," she said when he ended the second call. He looked at her. "You need access to the nursing administration portal," she said. "The document trail, before they have time to clean it. We have a monitoring order, not a search warrant. We can see communications, but we can't pull documents without—" "Then get the warrant," she said. "Because if Page knows the Meridian transfer failed this morning, and that memo tells me he's paying attention, then you have maybe a few hours before whoever's above him in that structure tells him to start deleting." Dre held her gaze for 2 full seconds. Then he turned to Foss. "Get Hollings on the warrant application. I need it moving in the next 30 minutes. Foss was already typing. Sarah looked back at the network diagram on the screen. Meridian core in the center. All the lines leading toward it and not quite reaching. She was about to say something else when Dre's phone buzzed. He looked at it and his face changed. Not dramatically, but enough. "What?" Sarah asked. Dre looked up. "Garth just asked for his phone call. That's standard?" "Yes." Dre set the phone on the table. "The number he wants to call is registered to a prepaid device. We've seen it once before in the Meridian intercepts." He paused. "It's the coordinator's contact line." Sarah went very still. "Kevin Garth is not a courier," she said slowly. "No," Dre said. "He's not." The crow on the parking structure outside had stopped walking. Sarah stared at the network diagram and at the central node that 14 months of investigation hadn't managed to name, and she understood that the man she'd put face down on the diner counter that morning had not been an operative running a pickup on behalf of someone else. He'd been running it on behalf of himself. And somewhere outside this building, Elliot Marsh, the man everyone in that diner had thought was the victim, was sitting in an FBI vehicle, and now Sarah needed to know what Marsh was thinking, because a man who just watched his coordinator get arrested while holding a briefcase full of 14 months' worth of federal evidence had exactly one logical next move. The question was whether he was going to make it. Dre was already moving toward the door, phone at his ear, and Foss had closed the laptop and stood, and Sarah got to her feet and followed them into the hallway and the controlled urgency of a federal operation that had just been turned inside out. And then Dre's radio crackled with a voice from the transport unit, tight and clipped, with the specific quality that Sarah recognized as someone managing news they didn't want to deliver. "Sir, we have a problem with the Marsh transport." Dre stopped walking. "Define problem," he said into the radio. A half-second pause that stretched like a wire pulled too tight. "He's gone." The word landed in the hallway like something physical. Dre had the radio up before the echo of it finished. "What do you mean, gone? Give me specifics." The agent on the other end was trying to keep his voice level and not quite managing it. Transport vehicle stopped for a medical call 2 blocks from the field office. Marsh complained of chest pain. Agents followed protocol, called for EMS. When the paramedics arrived and opened the rear doors, Marsh was unresponsive. They moved him to the ambulance. By the time the agents realized the paramedics weren't from the responding unit, they weren't real paramedics, Dre said. "The ambulance is registered to a private medical transport company. We're running it now. The vehicle's been found abandoned on Terrace Street. No Marsh, no personnel." Dre lowered the radio for exactly 2 seconds. Sarah watched him run the calculation behind his eyes. Not panic, not anger. The specific compressed focus of someone reorienting a large operation very fast. Lock down the field office. Get Garth into a secure room and off any communication channel. I want 2 agents on him personally, not a holding cell. He looked at Foss. "Where are we on the warrant?" "Hollings is on the phone with the duty judge." "Tell him we need it in 15 minutes, not 30. Tell him Marsh is in the wind." He looked at Sarah. "Does anything about that extraction feel improvised to you?" Sarah had been thinking about it since the word gone. "No," she said. "Chest pain is smart. It forces the agents to follow medical protocol, which means opening the vehicle, which means creating an access point. The fake paramedics were staged in advance. They knew the transport route." "How?" "Someone told them." Dre looked at her steadily. "From inside. Or from above. If Garth is the coordinator and Marsh is more central than you thought, Garth had time. Between the diner and the field office, even without his phone, someone in his network could have activated a contingency. He didn't have his phone. He didn't need it, Sarah said. If you're running an operation at this level, you don't leave your exit strategy tied to a single device. The extraction was pre-planned. The chest pain was the signal, not the cause. Dre was already moving again, walking fast down the hall toward the operations room at the end. Sarah and Foss followed without being asked. The operations room was larger than the conference room, with 3 workstations and a wall display currently showing a city map with GPS markers. 3 agents were at the stations. The energy in the room was the contained urgency of people who'd been through disruptions before and knew how to function inside them, but the Marsh situation had put a new edge on everything. Dre went straight to the wall display. "Show me the Terrace Street location." One of the agents pulled it up. The abandoned ambulance was on the east side of the city, industrial block, 3 warehouses and a loading facility. 6 minutes from the field office by the transport route. Sarah looked at the map. Something about the geography nagged at her. She stepped closer. "What's that building?" She pointed to a structure 2 blocks north of the ambulance location. The agent at the nearest station typed, "Harcourt Medical Supply, commercial distribution." Sarah looked at Dre. "Medical supply distribution." He caught it. "Medical infrastructure, cover for document movement." "Or more than cover." She studied the map. If Meridian has been using Callaway's administrative system to generate false transfer documents, they need somewhere to receive the physical components of those transfers. The data on the hard drive, it's digital, but the accompanying documentation, the chain of custody records that make it look legitimate, they need a physical address, Dre said, a medical address, something that explains why they're receiving research documentation. Dre turned to the agent at the station. "Pull everything on Harcourt Medical Supply, registration, ownership, any connection to Callaway Regional or to any name in the Meridian file." The agent started pulling records. Sarah stepped back and looked at the full map. The abandoned ambulance, the supply company, the field office, Callaway Regional, visible at the upper left edge of the display. The diner marked with a small indicator at the center. The geometry of it had a shape. She was trying to read the shape. Foss appeared beside her. "Warrants approved. Hollings is delivering it now." "Good," Dre said. "I need a team at Callaway in 20 minutes. Specifically the nursing administration records system and the procurement documentation for the past 8 months. Nobody touches anything until the team is there." "Paige is going to know we're coming the moment we walk in," Foss said. "Yes." Dre looked at the map. "Let him." Sarah understood the logic. If Paige panicked and tried to delete records, the deletion itself was evidence of consciousness of guilt, and the monitoring order meant they'd capture the deletion in real time. If he sat still, the warrant got them the documents without a fight. Either way, they won something. "What about Mercer?" Sarah asked. Dre looked at her. "Diane Mercer. She sent that memo 11 minutes after the diner scene started. She has access to the nursing administration portal. She knew enough about this morning to move fast." Sarah kept her voice even. "I'm not saying she's in the network. I'm saying she knew something was happening, and her first move was to cut off the person who'd already filed a report that got buried." Dre absorbed this. "You think Mercer's the connection between Paige and the clinical side? I think she's worth looking at before you walk into Callaway with a warrant and give anyone time to talk to anyone else." Something crossed Dre's face. Not quite appreciation, but the closest functional equivalent. He turned to Foss. "Include Mercer in the scope. Communications and access logs. To the room. I need the Harcourt ownership results in 5 minutes." Sarah sat down in an empty chair at the edge of the room. Her hands were in her lap, and she was aware of a low vibration in her body that she recognized as the sustained adrenaline response of someone who'd been operating at high alertness for several hours. She'd been awake since 4:15. She hadn't eaten anything except half of the granola bar. Her scrubs were the ones she'd worn through an 8-hour shift. She needed water, and she wasn't going to ask for it right now because the room was moving fast, and she wasn't going to be the person who interrupted for water. The agent at the station spoke without turning around. "Harcourt Medical Supply, registered to a holding company, Terrace Properties, LLC. Terrace Properties is registered to..." A pause. "A trust, Whitmore Family Trust, established 2019. The room went quiet enough that Sarah could hear the ventilation system. "Who administers the trust?" Dre said. The agent typed, waited. The listed administrator is a Gerald N. Page. Nobody moved for a moment. Sarah thought, of course. Page hadn't been manipulated. He'd been central. For 8 months, the federal investigation had been treating him as a potential access point, someone with leverage being applied to him, someone who might be a victim of circumstance navigating institutional pressure, and the whole time, he'd been the one who owned the physical infrastructure. The false document trail led back to his hospital portal and his holding company's address simultaneously. He was the paper trail. He'd built it himself. He's not peripheral, Sarah said. He's the architecture. Dre was already on his phone. I need a containment team at Callaway Regional Medical Center. Specific individuals, Gerald Page and Diane Mercer. Do not approach. Do not alert. Position and observe until I authorize. He ended the call and stood with the phone at his side for a moment, and Sarah watched him do the thing that good commanders did in bad situations. Absorb the new reality. Update the picture. Keep moving. The warrant covers Harcourt now? Sarah asked. It will in 20 minutes, Foss said from across the room, which means you have 20 minutes before Page potentially figures out his supply addresses in scope. We're aware, Dre said. He's going to run. Dre looked at her. What makes you say that? Because he's been careful for 2 years. He built a clean structure. The hospital portal, the holding company, the physical address all separated by enough layers that a routine investigation wouldn't connect them. The only thing that breaks that structure is someone connecting the dots from inside Callaway's clinical environment. She held his gaze, which is exactly what my pharmacy report started doing 3 months ago. He moved then. He buried the report, got Mercer to manage me. Today, the transfer failed, and the FBI walked into a diner where one of his operatives got taken down by a nurse he thought he'd already neutralized. He's not going to wait and see how this plays out. He's been running a contingency in his head since this morning. Dre was quiet for 3 full seconds. Foss. Already on it, Foss said. She was at a station, typing. Pulling his building access logs at Callaway for this morning. The result came back in under a minute. Page had badged out of Callaway Regional at 8:47 a.m. The emergency department's morning handoff would have been winding down. The diner incident had started at 7:43. By 8:47, it was already on the local news scanner. He left the building before the memo went out, Sarah said. Mercer sent the memo. He was already gone. He's had a 90-minute head start, the agent at the station said. Dre made 2 calls in rapid succession. The second one went to someone he called only by a last name, Reyes. And the conversation was brief enough that Sarah only caught fragments. Airport, private terminal, Whitmore Trust vehicles, photograph to border. He ended it and turned to the room. We need everything Page has touched in the past 72 hours. Travel bookings, financial transactions, any communication that left Callaway's system in the last 48 hours. That's going to take time we may not have, Foss said. I know. He didn't say anything else about it. Time was a constraint, not an argument. Sarah stood up. She'd been putting something together while Dre was on the phone, turning it slowly in the part of her mind that worked on things, whether she was paying attention or not. It had started with the network diagram, with the asymmetry she'd noticed, and now it had acquired another piece. The briefcase, she said. Dre looked at her. The hard drive in the briefcase. You said it contains the most recent data package, and the exchange this morning was supposed to complete before you arrived. Yes. Garth is in your secure room. Marsh is gone. Page is running. She looked at the map. But the briefcase is still here. The data package, whatever's on that drive, it hasn't moved, which means the buyers are still waiting. The room shifted. She could feel it. The collective recalibration. If Meridian has active buyers expecting a delivery that didn't happen, Sarah continued, they're going to make contact. And if Garth is the coordinator and he's in your custody, the contact is going to go somewhere else, to whoever handles his communications when he's unavailable. Marsh, Dre said, or whoever Marsh reports to when Garth is unavailable. The structure doesn't stop because the top got arrested. It roots around it. She looked at the network diagram still visible on the wall display. You haven't broken Meridian. You've disrupted one transaction. The buyers are going to reach out through every channel they have, And one of those channels might give you a contact point you haven't been able to identify in 14 months. Dre stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "We need to monitor every known Meridian communication channel for the next 6 hours." "You also need to think about who the buyers are," Sarah said. "If this is government-funded research on battlefield trauma pharmacology, the buyers aren't recreational, they're institutional. Military, pharmaceutical, foreign state level. Whoever is waiting for this delivery has resources, and they have their own security infrastructure. Meaning they'll know the delivery failed without being told. Meaning they may already be cutting their own threads." Dre looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than his usual controlled neutrality. It wasn't quite frustration, and it wasn't quite respect. It was something between the face of someone dealing with a variable they hadn't planned for. "You think like an analyst," he said. "I think like someone who's been in situations where the information picture changes faster than the plan," Sarah said. "Military medicine. You learn to update." He nodded once, slow. Then he moved to the wall display and started issuing instructions to the room, and Sarah stepped back and let him work, because she'd given him everything she had, and now the machinery of the investigation needed to do its part. She found a water bottle on the edge of one of the stations and drank half of it without asking whose it was. 20 minutes later, the warrant for Harcourt Medical Supply was confirmed, and a second team was moving toward the east side. Dre's containment team at Callaway had confirmed Mercer was still in the building. In her office, the Observer reported, on the phone, not her office line. "Personal cell," Foss said. "Can we get audio?" "Not without a separate basic. Get the application moving." At the 40-minute mark, the Harcourt team radioed in from outside the supply building. The front was locked, no visible movement. 3 vehicles in the adjacent lot, one of which matched a registration tied to a Meridian-associated shell company that had been in the file for 6 months. Dre authorized entry. Sarah listened to the radio feed from across the room. She wasn't part of the operation and she knew it, but nobody had asked her to leave, and she stayed because she needed to know how this came out. Not as a matter of professional interest, but as something more personal than that. The specific need of someone who'd spent 3 years at Callaway Regional doing their job correctly while something corrupt ran underneath it. The Harcourt team's radio traffic was clipped and procedural. Entry achieved, building clear, moving to storage. Then, "We have documents." Volume of documents, physical files, multiple boxes, storage room, north side. And then, "We have a server unit. Standalone, not networked. Looks like a backup system." And then, a pause that lasted long enough to mean something. "Sir, there are patient files in here, Callaway Regional headers. These aren't research files." Dre was at the radio. "Clarify. Medical records, individual patient files, names, diagnoses, treatment histories." Another pause. "There are hundreds of them." The room went still again. Sarah felt something drop through her, cold and specific. Patient files, not research data, not procurement documents, individual medical records belonging to real people who'd been treated at Callaway Regional. People who'd given their information to a hospital for the purpose of receiving care. They weren't just moving research data, she said. Dre turned to her. They were compiling patient records, personal medical histories. She kept her voice flat because the alternative was something she wasn't going to do in this room. That's a completely different market. Research data has a limited buyer pool. Military, pharmaceutical, state level. But personal medical records, she looked at him. Insurance fraud, identity theft infrastructure, pharmaceutical targeting. The data's worth more if it's layered. Meridian wasn't one operation, Dre said. It was never one operation. The research data was the premium product. The patient records were the volume business. She thought about the people whose files were in that room. Callaway's catchment area, working-class neighborhoods, a lot of uninsured or underinsured patients, people who didn't have the resources to monitor their own data. How long? Foss was already pulling records from the warrant database. Oldest file header the team is reporting, 2021. 2 years. 2 years of patient data moving out of Callaway Regional through Page's administrative infrastructure, through Mercer's portal access, through Harcourt's physical address, and into whatever downstream market Meridian had built for it. Sarah had treated patients from those neighborhoods. She had their faces in her memory: the carpenter Lou with the forearm laceration this morning, the woman in respiratory distress, the 7-year-old she'd flagged 3 months ago. She'd treated them and documented their care and trusted the institution to protect what she recorded. She put the water bottle down very carefully. "I need a minute," she said to no one in particular, and walked out of the operations room into the hallway. The hallway was fluorescent and quiet and smelled like recycled air. She stood against the wall with her arms crossed and breathed for 30 seconds, doing the specific thing she'd learned in the Army and refined in 3 years of ER work, which was letting herself feel the thing fully for exactly as long as she could afford, and then putting it in a place where it wouldn't interfere with function. 30 seconds. Then she went back in. Dre was coordinating 3 simultaneous operations: Harcourt, Callaway, and a developing situation at the airport where Reyes had flagged a private departure filing under a Whitmore trust entity that had been submitted that morning. Page was trying to leave the country. "How long until Reyes can get an intercept order?" Sarah asked. 20 minutes, Foss said. "If the flight file's on time, he boards in 15. Can the airport security authority hold the departure without the order? On what basis? An agent on the ground can request a delay for a security review. It's within their discretionary authority. It buys 20 minutes without requiring the order to be in hand." Dre was already on the phone. From across the room, Sarah heard him use the words security hold and administrative review, and then a name she didn't catch, and then he ended the call. "It's requested," he said. "Whether the airport authority honors it in the next—" His phone rang. He answered it, listened for 4 seconds, and his face did the thing it had done when he heard Marsh was gone. The same compressed stillness, but deeper. "Say that again," he said. Whoever was on the other end said it again. Dre looked up at the room, at Foss, at Sarah. "Page isn't at the airport," he said. "The Whitmore filing was a decoy. Reyes's team has the terminal and Page is not on it." The room processed this. "He knew we'd look at travel," Sarah said. "He filed the departure to draw your resources to the airport." "Yes." "So where is he?" Nobody answered that. The map on the wall display sat in its silent geometry. The diner, the field office, Callaway, Harcourt, the airport on the eastern edge. All the markers, all the lines. And somewhere not on the map, Gerald Page was running a plan he'd had ready for 2 years, with a 90-minute head start and the resources of a network that had moved stolen data and patient records across institutional lines without detection for longer than most federal investigations lasted. Foss's station chimed. She looked at the screen and went very still. "What?" Dre said. "Monitoring alert from Callaway's internal system." She turned the screen. 3 minutes ago. Someone accessed the nursing administration portal using Mercer's credentials. "Mercer's in her office," Dre said. "Confirm." Confirmed by the observer. "She's in her office. She didn't access the portal." "Someone using her credentials remotely," Sarah said. "Or someone who has her credentials. What did they access?" Dre was at Foss's station now. Foss pulled the log. "They pulled the pharmacy report filed 3 months ago." A pause. "And they flagged it for deletion." Sarah heard her own breath. Someone had just tried to delete her report. The same report that had started all of this. Not Page. Page was running, not Mercer. Mercer was in her office. Someone else, with Mercer's credentials, with access to Callaway's internal system, trying to erase the one document that had put a civilian nurse on the edge of a federal investigation. "Did the deletion go through?" Dre said. "No." Foss's voice was careful. "The monitoring order has the system flagged. The deletion attempt was captured and blocked." She paused again. "But the access point, the IP address it routed through. It's not a Callaway terminal." "Where is it?" Foss looked at the screen, then at Dre, then across the room at Sarah. "It's this building," she said. "It's routing from inside the field office." The silence that followed had a different quality than all the previous silences in the last 2 hours. Those had been the silence of information being processed, of plans being adjusted, of people managing the pace of events. This one was the silence of everyone in the room, understanding simultaneously that someone who wasn't supposed to be here was, and that everything they'd been doing for the last 2 hours had been observed from inside the room they were doing it in. Dre drew his weapon. Sarah's hand went to her side before she caught herself. She was in scrubs, not kit, and the motion was 3 years of civilian life fighting against 8 years of something older. She stopped it and stayed absolutely still instead, because moving wrong in a room full of drawn weapons was its own kind of lethality. Dre looked at Foss. "Which terminal?" Foss looked at her screen. "Station 3. Station 3 was the workstation on the far right. The agent who'd been sitting there 20 minutes ago had gone to the break room for coffee. The chair was empty, but the terminal was still logged in, and on its screen, just barely visible from across the room, was a window that hadn't been there before. An open remote access session connected to Callaway Regional's administrative system, showing the nursing portal login and a single document highlighted in the deletion queue. Sarah's pharmacy report, 3 months old, still trying to be erased. And on the floor beside the station, half hidden by the desk panel, something that hadn't been there when Sarah walked in. A phone. Prepaid, black, screen dark. The same kind of phone, she was suddenly certain, as the coordinator's contact line that Garth had asked to call from custody. Dre moved first, and he moved fast. "Clear the room," he said, and the 2 remaining agents were on their feet before he finished the sentence. "Foss, freeze that terminal. Don't let it close the session." Foss was already at the keyboard. Sarah stayed exactly where she was. Not because she was told to, but because she was doing the same calculation Dre was doing, which was figuring out the geometry of a room where someone had just used a federal workstation to reach into a hospital system, and the phone on the floor was either evidence or a signal, and the answer to which one mattered more than the phone itself. "Who had access to that station?" Dre said. One of the agents, Karev, 30s, the one who'd been pulling the Harcourt ownership records, said, "3 people used Station 3 today. Myself, Hollings before he left for the warrant, and—" He stopped. "And who?" "Briggs." Karev's voice had gone flat. "He came in about 40 minutes after you brought her in." A small hesitation. "He said he was pulling background for the Marsh file." "Where's Briggs now?" Nobody answered that. Dre looked at Foss. "Get me Briggs's location. Badge, building log, camera, anything." Foss worked the keyboard. The session on Station 3 was frozen mid-deletion. Sarah's pharmacy report held in the system's buffer like something caught between states. The phone on the floor was still there, dark and silent. Sarah walked over to it carefully and crouched down without touching it. It was a standard prepaid unit, the kind sold at gas stations and drugstores, screen cracked at one corner. No case, nothing visible on the exterior to distinguish it. She looked up at Dre. "Did Garth have a phone on him when he was brought in?" "He was searched at the diner." "That's not what I asked." Dre looked at Karev. Karev pulled up the intake record on his tablet. His jaw tightened. A phone was listed in his personal effects, entered into evidence at the diner, but, he scrolled, it was a different model, newer. "So this one wasn't his," Sarah said, "which means it was already in this building." The room absorbed that. Briggs had brought it in, set it up at Station 3, left it running a remote session into Callaway's system, and walked out of the operations room before anyone noticed what he'd done at the terminal. The session was automated. He didn't need to be at the keyboard once it was initiated. The deletion would have run quietly and completed in under a minute if Foss's monitoring alert hadn't caught it in the buffer. "He knew about my report," Sarah said. "Specifically. That's not general knowledge. That was internal to Callaway's nursing administration system." She stood. "He's been inside the investigation. He's known what we were building for at least as long as he's been in this office." Dre had his phone out. "I need Briggs's vehicle and home address flagged immediately. He is not to be approached without direct authorization from me. Treat it as a potential inside disclosure and follow Protocol 7. He paused, listening. "Yes, I'm certain." He ended the call. Something in his posture had changed, not dramatically, but Sarah had been reading people in high-pressure environments long enough to recognize the particular internal adjustment of a commander who just absorbed a hit he hadn't seen coming and was refusing to let it show at the expense of function. "How long has Briggs been assigned to this case?" Sarah asked. Dre looked at her, a fraction too long before he answered. 7 months. 7 months. Nearly the entirety of the final phase of the investigation. She did the math without saying it out loud. 7 months of someone with federal access watching the case build, watching the Callaway connection develop, watching Sarah's pharmacy report get flagged in the monitoring system. 7 months of someone routing information backward through the very investigation designed to stop it. Foss said, from the terminal, "I have Briggs on building camera. He exited via the south stairwell 11 minutes ago, before the Harcourt radio call came in." "He knew we'd get the patient files," Sarah said. "Yes," Dre said. "He ran before we could. But he left the phone. He was in a hurry. Or he left it on purpose." Sarah looked at the phone on the floor. A prepaid unit connected to the coordinator's contact network, found in a federal field office. That's embarrassing, but it's not actionable against Meridian. He might have wanted you to find it after he was gone. Proof of contamination. Your investigation is tainted, your evidence chain is compromised, any defense attorney in the country uses it to argue the case was built on a poisoned tree. The room went very quiet. Dre looked at the phone, then at Foss, then at Sarah. He was working through the same sequence she had, and she could see the moment he arrived at the same destination. "It doesn't work," he said. "No," she agreed. "Because the pharmacy report is still in the buffer. It wasn't deleted. The monitoring order captured the deletion attempt in real time, which means the attempt itself is documented independently of anything that happened on that terminal." She kept her voice steady. "You can show exactly what the session tried to do, when it tried to do it, and from what access point. The taint argument collapses because the evidence of tampering is itself part of the record." Dre looked at her for a long moment. "You understand federal evidence law." "I understand that if someone tries to erase a document and fails, the failure is proof of what they were trying to hide." He held her gaze. "Where did you learn to think this way?" 11 months in a place where the wrong call cost people their lives," she said. "You get good at reading the board fast, or you get worse outcomes." He nodded once. Then he turned back to the room and picked up where the crisis had knocked him sideways. "Because that was what you did. You absorbed it and you kept moving, because the alternative was letting the disruption do more work than it needed to." The next 2 hours were operational in a way that left Sarah sitting at the edge of the room watching a large coordinated system do what large coordinated systems did when they had sufficient evidence and sufficient pressure. They moved. Warrants executed, locations secured, communications monitored in real time. The Callaway team arrived at the hospital at 10:14 a.m. with the warrant and 2 agents Sarah didn't know. Mercer was in her office when they came through the door. The observer outside confirmed she made 1 phone call in the 90 seconds between the team entering the building and reaching her floor. She called Paige's cell. It went to voicemail. Mercer's interview was conducted at Callaway, not the field office, which Sarah heard secondhand through the radio feed. It lasted 40 minutes and generated, according to Foss's summary afterward, a significant volume of information about Paige's administrative arrangements and a significantly smaller volume of acknowledgement of Mercer's own role. She was cooperative about what she called his behavior, and notably silent about her own access to the nursing portal. "She didn't know the full scope," Foss said to Dre, reading from her notes. "That's their assessment. She knew something was moving through the system. She knew Paige was involved. She handled personnel management in ways that protected the operation. The pharmacy report, the Voss reassignment. But she wasn't read into the network. She was useful, and she was kept at arm's length." "Does that make her culpable?" Sarah asked. Foss glanced at her. "That's for the prosecutor." "I'm asking what you think." Foss considered this with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd been trained not to editorialize. "She moved a person off a floor and buried a report that was identifying criminal activity. She didn't do it knowing the full picture, but she did it." A pause. "So yes." Sarah thought about Mercer's voice that morning. "I'm not sure this environment is the right fit for you, the certainty of it, the specific bureaucratic confidence of someone who believed they were managing a situation cleanly. The situation had not stayed clean." At 11:30 a.m., The Briggs was located at a bus terminal on the city's south side, 17 blocks from the field office. He'd been sitting in the terminal's food court with a backpack and a ticket to a connecting route that would have put him on a train to a city 3 states away by evening. 2 agents picked him up without incident, which Sarah found faintly disappointing in a way she didn't entirely examine. The thing about people who worked institutional corruption was that they were rarely the kind of person who went down fighting. They built structures, they used systems, they moved paper, and when those structures collapsed, they ran for the bus. Briggs had been inside a federal investigation for 7 months, feeding information to Meridian, watching the walls close, and his exit plan was a backpack and a transit ticket. Dre told her this with the flatness of someone who'd seen it before. "It's always like this," he said. "The people who do the most damage are the least dramatic when it ends." "What about Paige?" "Still working it." She'd been in the field office for over 3 hours by then. The water bottle was empty. Someone had left a box of granola bars on the counter by the coffee station, the same brand she had in her pocket, which she found either convenient or absurd, and she'd eaten 2 of them standing up because she couldn't sit still anymore. At noon, the breakthrough on Paige came from a direction nobody had anticipated. It came from the briefcase. The forensic team had been working the hard drive since the briefcase was processed at the field office. The drive itself was encrypted, but the encryption protocol had been applied over an existing file structure, which meant the metadata was partially legible even without breaking the encryption. The file names were coded, but the creation timestamps were intact. The most recent file had been created at 6:48 a.m. that morning, before the diner opened, before the exchange was supposed to take place. "Someone added to the drive this morning before Marsh picked it up," Foss said, pulling the forensic report. "Paige," Sarah said. She was looking at the timestamp. Callaway Regional's administrative badge logs showed Paige entering the building at 5:55 a.m. that morning, early, for a CNO. He was at the hospital this morning before anyone else. "Adding to the package," Dre said. He was reading over Foss's shoulder. He wasn't just an administrator. He was a contributor. He was adding data to the shipment. "Which means the drive contains both research data and patient records," Sarah said. He bundled them, the research data for the premium buyers, the patient records for the volume side. 1 delivery, 2 markets. Dre straightened. "The metadata on the file. Can we use it to identify the source system it was created on?" The forensic tech on the other end of Foss's call apparently said yes, because Foss looked up and said, "It originated from a system registered to Harcourt Medical Supply." Not Callaway's system, Harcourt's. "He has a workstation at the supply company," Sarah said. "That's where he built the packages. The hospital gave him the raw material. The holding company gave him the assembly point. And that workstation is now inside our warrant perimeter," Dre said, "if he didn't wipe it before he ran." Dre was on the radio to the Harcourt team inside of 30 seconds. The answer came back 4 minutes later. The workstation at Harcourt had not been wiped. It had been shut down, not scrubbed, just closed, in what appeared to be a hurried exit. The forensic team on site was already imaging the drive. Paige had left in too much of a hurry to clean up properly. He'd planned for the airport contingency, he'd filed the decoy departure, but somewhere in the execution of his exit, he'd run short of time, or nerve, and left the workstation intact. Sarah thought about what that meant. Paige had been meticulous for 2 years. The structure was careful, layered, institutional. He'd buried her pharmacy report. He'd managed Mercer. He'd built a holding company and a physical address that were separated from the hospital by enough bureaucratic distance to survive a routine investigation. And then one Tuesday morning, a nurse he'd tried to sideline had stopped an exchange in a diner, and everything he'd built had started coming apart faster than he could manage it. She didn't let herself feel satisfied about this yet. Paige was still not in custody. At 1:15 p.m., the Harcourt forensic team confirmed the workstation contained, among other things, a complete contacts directory for Meridian's buyer network. Names, not code identifiers. Actual names, institutions, contact protocols. 14 months of federal investigation had produced code names and structural inference. Gerald Page's insufficiently wiped workstation produced a list. Dre read the preliminary summary from his phone and said nothing for about 10 seconds. Then he said, 6 of the buyers are institutional entities in 4 countries. 2 of them are registered with organizations that have federal contractor status. Sarah understood what that meant. Defense contractors. Yes. Buying stolen defense contractor research. The competition, Dre said, with a flatness that contained something much darker than irony. The buyer list changed the scope of the investigation in ways that Sarah couldn't fully track from her position at the edge of the operations room. She caught fragments, references to coordination with other agencies, jurisdictional protocols for international components, the specific procedural complexity of an investigation that had just grown several times larger than the file it started as. She was not part of that. She understood that clearly. She was a witness, a source of information, someone whose pharmacy report and pattern recognition had contributed to a morning that had broken something open. But the machinery now running was larger than anything she had a role in, and she sat with that and let it be true without requiring it to be otherwise. At 2:07 p.m., Dre came and found her where she'd moved, back to the conference room on the 4th floor, sitting at the long table, looking at nothing in particular. He sat down across from her. Not immediately across. One chair off, which felt like a deliberate choice to not make it feel like another debrief. "You should know where things stand," he said. "Okay." Mercer is in a formal interview process. Her attorney arrived 30 minutes ago, which tells you she had one on speed dial, which tells you something about what she knew. He folded his hands on the table. Briggs is in custody. He's not talking yet, but the phone from Station 3 has been matched to 3 contacts in the Meridian communication intercept spanning the last 7 months. His attorney is going to have a hard time explaining that. And Paige? We have a federal arrest warrant. We have every transport checkpoint in the state flagged. We have his photograph at every viable exit point. A pause. We don't have him yet. Sarah nodded. She'd expected that. Paige had planned. He'd just planned imperfectly. The workstation contents, she said. The buyer list. That's going to take this beyond Callaway. Significantly beyond. And Garth? Kevin Garth has been formally identified as the primary coordinator for Meridian's domestic operations. He asked for a lawyer about 2 hours ago and hasn't said anything since. But the workstation data corroborates his position in the structure independently of anything he says. Dre looked at the table. He made a mistake this morning. He underestimated the room, Sarah said. He underestimated one person in the room. She looked at him. He held the look with the same controlled neutrality he'd held everything else with, but there was something underneath it that was less managed, a frank acknowledgement, the kind that came out when the performance of authority relaxed slightly in a room with nobody else in it. "What happens to my report?" she asked. "The pharmacy report from 3 months ago. It becomes part of the evidence record. It'll be cited as an early identification event." He paused. The attempt to delete it is itself a significant piece of the obstruction case against Briggs and the pattern of conduct case against Paige. "And my access credentials at Callaway? The suspension is invalid. It was issued by individuals now under federal investigation using their administrative access to interfere with a potential witness. Legally, it doesn't stand." He looked at her directly. "Whether you want to go back is a different question." Sarah thought about that. She thought about the ER at Callaway, Bay 3, and the forearm lacerations, and the pediatric patient she'd flagged, and the woman in respiratory distress, and all the ordinary emergencies that happened every day in a building that had been running corruption through its administrative backbone for 2 years. The patients hadn't known. The nurses on the floor hadn't known, most of them. The work had been real even when the institution around it wasn't. "I'll figure that out," she said. Dre nodded. He stood, then paused before he left. "The briefcase. The drive." "Yes. When the encryption is broken, and we have people working it, the data on it is going to represent the most complete single evidence package we've assembled in this investigation." He looked at her steadily. "The chain of custody is intact because you preserved the scene. You didn't open it, you didn't move it, you told Marsh to keep his hands off it. A defense attorney is going to try to argue civilian interference." He paused. "They won't get far. Because I'm a nurse. Because you're a combat-trained Army medic who happened to be in the right place and made exactly the right calls." He let that sit. Your statement is the strongest piece of direct testimony we have." He left. Sarah sat with the quiet of the empty conference room for a while. The afternoon had shifted the light through the fourth-floor windows. It was past 2. She'd been awake for 10 hours, in scrubs, in a federal building, running on 2 granola bars and cold coffee, and the specific sustained alertness that old training produced in old situations. Her phone had 23 notifications. Her sister had called twice. There was a text from a number she recognized as Dr. Hargrove, the attending she'd worked with most often in the Callaway ER, that said only heard something happened. "You okay?" She'd answer that later. She didn't know what to say yet. She was sitting there when Foss came in. "Something you need to see," Foss said. She had her laptop open. Sarah looked at the screen. It was a live feed from a camera. Exterior, what looked like a parking structure. The timestamp in the corner was current, ticking forward in real time. "Where is this?" Sarah asked. "Attached to Callaway Regional. East parking deck, level 2. Foss pointed to a figure in the frame. "That's been sitting there for about 18 minutes. Sarah leaned forward and looked. A man standing beside a parked car on the second level of the hospital's parking structure. Gray coat. His back was to the camera, but the posture and the way he was standing, the stillness of someone waiting for a decision to resolve, had an identifiable quality. "How certain are you?" Sarah asked. The coat matches what he was wearing this morning from Callaway's interior camera. And the car, Boss zoomed the image, is registered to a company that we didn't have in the file until an hour ago, when the workstation data started coming in. It's a secondary holding entity under the Whitmore Trust structure. Gerald Page was at Callaway Regional. He'd gone back. Sarah stared at the screen and tried to work out the logic of it, because a man running from a federal warrant didn't go back to the building at the center of the investigation unless he had a reason. The airport had been a decoy. The workstation at Harcourt had been left because he was in a hurry. He'd been managing multiple contingencies simultaneously all morning, and something had gone wrong in the sequence. "He went back for something," Sarah said. "Something he didn't get out in time." "The workstation data is being imaged now," Foss said. "If there was something on it he needed, not the workstation." Sarah was thinking fast. The workstation was at Harcourt. Whatever he went back for is at Callaway. Something physical, or something in a system that isn't in the warrant scope yet. "Foss." Dre's voice came from the doorway. He'd appeared without either of them hearing him. He was looking at the screen. "Do we have a team at Callaway right now?" "Interview team with Mercer, 2 agents. Can they reach the east parking deck in 6 minutes, maybe 5? Tell them 3. He was already on his phone. "And I need local units at every exit of that structure right now. He has a car, which means he has somewhere to go. We don't let him get there." Foss was talking into her earpiece. Sarah looked at the screen. Page hadn't moved. He was still standing beside the car, and from the slight angle of his head, it looked like he was on a phone call. His posture had changed in the last 30 seconds. She could see it even at this resolution, the specific shift of a body receiving news it didn't want. "He knows," she said. Dre looked at the screen. Page's posture had shifted again, weight back, hand at his side. "He knows the workstation data is compromised," Sarah said. "Someone just told him. Whatever he came back for, he's finding out it's too late." The figure on the screen stood very still for 5 seconds. Then he walked toward the parking deck stairwell door and went through it, and the feed lost him. "Which floor does that stairwell connect to?" Dre said. Foss pulled the building schematic. "Ground level exits to the hospital's east service corridor." A pause. "The service corridor connects to the emergency department." Sarah was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. The emergency department. Her department. The floor she'd worked for 3 years, that she knew the way she knew her own hands. Every bay, every supply room, every secondary exit, every camera blind spot that the facilities team hadn't gotten around to addressing. She looked at Dre. He was already moving. "You know that building," he said. "Every inch of it. Then you're going to walk me through it." They moved into the hallway, and Foss was behind them, and the radio in Dre's hand was putting out a rapid stream of position updates from the agents already converging on Callaway Regional, and Sarah was running the ER layout in her head, The service corridor that connected to the loading dock, the secondary stairwell behind the medication room, the exit that opened into the ambulance bay that most people forgot existed because it was behind a door marked restricted that the facilities team had never gotten around to actually locking. The door that Sarah had used to step outside for air on night shifts more times than she could count. Paige had been at Callaway for 2 years. He knew the building, too. The question was whether he knew it as well as she did, and she was already running the answer in her head. And the answer was not a chance, because he was a CNO who walked the administrative corridor and attended board meetings, and she was the person who'd been in every corner of that building at 4 in the morning when the only people awake were the ones who had nowhere else to be. Dre had his hand on the stairwell door when his radio crackled with something that stopped him. The voice was from the Callaway interview team. It was tight and controlled and had the specific quality of someone reporting something they didn't entirely believe yet. "Sir, we have a situation in the ER. Mercer's attorney just came out of the interview room and said Mercer is requesting to make a voluntary disclosure." A pause. "She says she knows where Paige is going and why." Dre stood with his hand on the door. Sarah looked at him. "She's been running her own calculation this whole time," Sarah said. She didn't know the full scope. But she knew Paige. She knew his habits. And she just watched the FBI walk into her building with a warrant, and she's deciding which side of this she wants to be on when it resolves. "What does she know that we don't?" Dre said. "Whatever Paige went back for. Whatever he has at Callaway that he couldn't leave behind." Sarah held his gaze. "She knows that building the same way I do. Different floor, different function, same institution." Dre looked at the radio, at the door, at Sarah. "Tell the interview team to get Mercer on the phone with me," he said into the radio. Then he pushed through the stairwell door and Sarah followed him, because whatever Mercer was about to say, they were already moving toward the building it was about, and the next few minutes were going to determine whether Gerald Page walked out of Callaway Regional or didn't walk out at all. They were halfway down the stairs when Dre's phone connected and Mercer's voice came through. Not flat the way it was in the hallways of the nursing floor, not the practiced authority of a supervisor managing a subordinate, but something rawer and less composed, the voice of a woman who'd been maintaining a particular posture for a long time and had just let it go. "There's a secondary server," Mercer said. "He told me it was a backup for administrative data." I believed him. A pause that had the weight of someone deciding to finish a sentence they'd started. "It's in the equipment room adjacent to the pharmacy, sub-basement level. It's not on any of the hospital's official infrastructure records." Dre looked at Sarah. Sub-basement, equipment room, adjacent to the pharmacy. Sarah knew exactly where that room was. She knew it because 3 months ago, when she'd been cross-referencing pharmacy logs and something had felt wrong, she'd walked through that corridor twice trying to understand the layout of the supply chain. She'd noticed the equipment room door. She'd thought it was an HVAC access point. She'd never thought to look inside. The sub-basement of Callaway Regional was the part of the building that existed in the institutional memory of people who'd worked there long enough but never appeared in any orientation packet or official tour. It was where the building kept its ugly infrastructure, the HVAC systems, the aging pipe runs, the overflow storage that nobody had gotten around to cataloging since the last renovation that had been completed 7 years ago and immediately forgotten. The lighting down there was the fluorescent kind that never quite reached the corners, and the floor was bare concrete that amplified every footstep into something that sounded like an accusation. Sarah knew the route because she'd walked it 3 months ago, following the pharmacy supply chain with a flashlight she'd borrowed from the maintenance closet and a clipboard she'd been using to track the discrepancy that nobody wanted her to track. She remembered the smell. Cold metal and old dust and something chemical that was probably the cleaning product stored in the second room on the left. She remembered the door at the end of the corridor that she'd assumed was HVAC access because it had an HVAC maintenance sticker on it that looked original to the building. She led Dre through it now, with 2 agents behind them, and the sound of additional units converging on the building's east entrance through Dre's radio. The stairwell to the sub-basement was accessed through the pharmacy's service corridor, a door that required a staff badge, but whose magnetic lock had been intermittently malfunctioning for 6 weeks, according to the maintenance request that Sarah had personally seen on the facilities board and mentally filed as one of the small institutional failures that accumulated in underfunded hospitals like geological sediment. The lock was malfunctioning now. The door opened on the second push. Dre went through first, which she didn't argue. She followed, pointing left at the bottom of the stairs, and they moved down the corridor with the practiced quiet of people who understood that the person they were looking for had arrived before them, and the element of surprise was a resource being depleted with every second. The door at the end of the corridor was open, not ajar. Open, fully, with the specific carelessness of someone who'd moved through it in a hurry and hadn't pulled it closed behind them because closing it cost 2 seconds, and 2 seconds mattered. Dre raised his hand and they stopped. He listened. From inside the room came a sound Sarah initially categorized as equipment cycling and then recognized as something else. The particular pattern of a keyboard being worked rapidly, with the intermittent pauses of someone entering commands they had to think about. Dre moved to the door. What was inside was not large. It was the size of a storage room repurposed with the specific improvisation of someone who needed function over aesthetics. 3 server units against the back wall, a small workstation desk that had been a folding table until recently, cable management that was functional without being clean. The room was cold the way server rooms were always cold, the cooling units doing their quiet, constant work regardless of what else was happening. Gerald Page was at the workstation with his back to the door. He heard them, or felt them, the change in the room's air pressure, the difference in ambient sound, and his hand stopped on the keyboard and his shoulders dropped about half an inch, which was the body's involuntary acknowledgement of something it didn't want to acknowledge. He didn't turn around. "Step back from the workstation," Dre said. "Hands where I can see them." Page's hands came up slowly. He turned on the stool and looked at the door and at Dre and at the agents and then, last, at Sarah. His expression was not what she'd expected. She'd expected the specific blankness of someone caught in a lie, the flat defensive neutrality that people adopted when they'd been exposed and were still deciding what posture to take. She'd seen it in the diner on Marsh's face, in the interview room in Briggs's silence. What Page looked like instead was tired. Not frightened, not calculating. Just exhausted, in the particular way of someone who'd been holding something up for a very long time and had just let it down. He was 61 years old, she realized. She'd thought of him all morning as a force, a strategic actor, an architect of something complex and corrupt. And standing in this room under fluorescent light, he was a tired man in a gray coat sitting on a folding stool with his hands in the air. "Don't touch the workstation," Dre said to the agent behind him. "Get the forensic team down here before anyone accesses it." "It's encrypted," Page said. His voice was flat and had nothing performative in it. "You'll need the passphrase. We'll manage." "I know." He lowered his hands to his knees when Dre didn't object to it. "I came back to run the wipe sequence. The workstation at Harcourt. I didn't have time. I thought if I could get the server wiped before—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter." "No," Dre said. "It doesn't." Page looked at Sarah again. There was something in his eyes that she spent a moment identifying, and what she identified was not guilt exactly. It was the specific, exhausted recognition of someone looking at the variable they hadn't accounted for. She'd been the thing that didn't fit his model. The nurse he'd had reassigned, whose report he'd buried, who had walked into a diner 3 blocks from his hospital and dismantled the transaction he'd spent months coordinating, and then walked into a federal building and started connecting dots that his inside source hadn't managed to erase. He hadn't underestimated her deliberately. He simply hadn't considered her significant enough to underestimate in the first place. That was the thing about people like Page. They built their structures around the assumption that institutions would keep the people inside them small. The assumption had worked for 2 years. "The patients," Sarah said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out even and clear. "The people whose files are in boxes at Harcourt. They came to Callaway because they needed care. That's the only reason they gave us their information." Page didn't look away. "I know." "That's not an answer." He looked at the floor. "No," he said. "It's not." Dre moved, and the agents moved, and the procedural machinery of arrest engaged with the impersonal efficiency of a system that had done it 1,000 times. The statement of charges, the restraints, the reading of rights in the cold air of a server room in a hospital sub-basement, while the cooling unit cycled on without interruption. It was not dramatic. It was the bureaucratic terminus of something that had been running for a long time, and it looked exactly like what it was. A man in a gray coat being walked out of a building he'd used as a tool. Sarah stayed in the doorway while it happened and then stepped aside to let them through. The corridor was empty as they walked him toward the stairs. She watched until they turned the corner and the sound of footsteps receded, and then she turned back to the server room and stood in the cold and the fluorescent light for a moment alone with the hum of 3 machines that had been quietly moving stolen data and patient records through institutional channels while she'd been 3 floors above doing her job. She was not going to cry. She hadn't cried about a work situation since a pediatric case in her first month at Callaway that she still thought about, and this wasn't comparable to that, and she wasn't going to now. She took a breath. She turned off the server room light and walked back up the stairs. The next 72 hours moved in the way of things that had been compressed, fast in some places, glacially slow in others. The Harcourt workstation yielded its data. The server room machines were imaged before any wipe sequence completed. The buyer network identified from Page's files generated 4 separate federal actions across 2 other agencies, none of which Sarah was briefed on in detail, and most of which she'd probably never know the outcome of. Kevin Garth was formally charged with racketeering, criminal conspiracy, and theft of government property, among 11 additional counts that the prosecutor's office consolidated across 3 jurisdictions. His attorney entered a not guilty plea that nobody in the federal building took seriously, given that the evidence package from the hard drive, once decrypted 41 hours after the diner, contained transaction records, communication logs, and buyer correspondence that documented 4 years of Meridian's domestic operations in a level of detail that the prosecution called, in the court filing Sarah eventually read, among the most comprehensive self-documentation of criminal enterprise we have encountered. Garth had kept records. Meticulous ones. It was the same institutional instinct that had made him effective, the careful documentation of a man who didn't trust anyone else to hold the information. And it was what made the case against him close to unlosable. Elliot Marsh was apprehended 6 days later at a rental property in a coastal city 400 miles away, using a name that was good enough to pass a casual check, but not good enough to pass the kind that gets run when your photograph is in federal circulation. He made one statement before his attorney arrived, which was that he wanted to cooperate. His cooperation proved useful and significantly reduced his eventual sentencing exposure, though not to the degree he'd hoped. Briggs was charged with obstruction and federal corruption. He eventually pled to a reduced count in exchange for a full accounting of what he'd disclosed to Meridian over 7 months. The accounting was specific and damaging to several individuals, one of whom was a mid-level supervisor in another field office that had nothing to do with Sarah's situation and whose name she never learned. Diane Mercer was not charged. She was terminated from Callaway Regional pending a full administrative review, and the documentation of her role in suppressing Sarah's pharmacy report was included in the evidence record as an act of obstruction by a non-knowing participant, which was the legal language for someone who'd helped and hadn't fully understood what they were helping. Sarah's opinion about whether that designation was deserved was not solicited, and she kept it to herself because she'd had the experience of the justice system producing outcomes she agreed with for the right reasons and outcomes she disagreed with for complicated ones. And this was the complicated category, and she wasn't the prosecutor. Gerald Page was charged on 11 counts, including racketeering, wire fraud, theft of government research, and unlawful exploitation of protected health information. The last charge carrying consequences that were civil as well as criminal, because the patient records he'd moved through Harcourt weren't just evidence of one crime. They were evidence of harm to specific individuals who had recourse. The class action that developed alongside the criminal case was not Sarah's domain, but the attorney handling it called her twice. And both times she gave the same answer. She would cooperate with whatever process served the patients. What she did not say, in any of the formal or informal conversations that followed, was that she thought about those patients specifically and often, not abstractly. She thought about Lou the carpenter, who'd talked about his daughter's soccer tournament while she sutured his arm, who'd probably been a patient at Callaway before that, whose records might be in those boxes. She thought about the woman in respiratory distress. She thought about the 7-year-old she'd flagged, whose records she had touched, whose information she'd documented in Calloway's system with the assumption that documentation was an act of protection. She thought about what it meant to work inside a system that was supposed to be trustworthy and wasn't, and to have done the work correctly anyway, and to not have known the difference until one Tuesday morning broke everything open. She decided, eventually, that the work being real didn't depend on the institution being clean. The patients had needed care, and she'd given it. That part was not undone by what Paige had built in the sub-basement. It was just complicated. Most things were if you stayed with them long enough to find out. 3 weeks after the morning at Harlow's Diner, Sarah Voss was sitting in a conference room at Callaway Regional that was not the same conference room where Mercer had told her she wasn't suited for the environment. This one was on the 3rd floor, had better light, and was occupied by the hospital's interim administration board, a group of 6 people who had been assembled after Paige's arrest to manage both the institutional response and the significant task of figuring out what the organization actually looked like without the 2 people who'd been running its administrative functions. They had asked Sarah to come in. She had come in. Not in scrubs. She'd worn her own clothes, jeans, and a dark jacket, because she was not currently a Callaway employee, and she wasn't going to dress like one until she chose to be. The board chair was a woman named Okafor, who'd been brought in from the health system's regional office, and who had the specific manner of someone parachuted into a mess and determined to be efficient about it. She'd reviewed the full record. She understood what Sarah had done and what had been done to Sarah. "Your access credentials were reinstated as of last Monday," Okafor said. "That's already done. What I want to talk about is what comes after." Sarah waited. "The hospital needs to rebuild something," Okafor said. "Trust partly. Infrastructure partly. The procurement and administrative documentation systems have to be rebuilt essentially from scratch because we can't certify the integrity of what was running under Paige." She folded her hands. "But more than the systems, the clinical safety reporting process. The mechanism that's supposed to allow a nurse to file a report and have it go somewhere real." "It didn't go somewhere real," Sarah said. "No, it got buried by the people it was supposed to be reviewed by. That's a structural failure and a personnel failure, and it's not going to happen the same way again." Okafor looked at her directly. "I want to know if you'd be willing to lead the rebuild of that process, not in addition to clinical work, as a specific role. Clinical safety and reporting infrastructure, with direct accountability to this board and not to an intermediate administrative layer." Sarah looked at the table, then at Okafor. She'd spent the 3 weeks since the diner doing things she didn't usually have time to do, sleeping enough, talking to her sister, going for runs in the morning when the light was still low. She'd cooked actual meals. She'd called 2 of her army friends, people she'd stayed in loose contact with, and let the contact get looser, and the conversations had been good in the way that conversations were when you remembered why you'd needed them. She'd been through the decompression of something significant and had done it without pretending it wasn't happening, which was newer for her than she would have admitted. She'd also thought every day about what she wanted next, whether she wanted to go back, whether the building was worth going back to, whether the work was the same work if the context had changed. What she'd kept coming back to was the pharmacy report, not the investigation it had helped break open. That was someone else's work, the report itself. The fact that she'd noticed something wrong, documented it precisely, submitted it through the proper channels, and been shut down. And then she'd done it again, differently, in a diner, and it hadn't been shut down. The system had failed. She hadn't. "The reporting infrastructure," Sarah said. "If I rebuild it, it reports to the board directly, no intermediate layer." "Agreed." "And the clinical side of my role isn't reduced. I'm not leaving the ER." Okafor didn't hesitate. "Also agreed." Sarah looked at her for a moment. "Why me specifically?" Okafor looked at her with the frank expression of someone who'd read a file and formed an opinion. "Because the person who catches a problem in the system is usually the person who understands the system well enough to fix it, and because the staff here needs to see someone they already know doing this work, not someone from outside who doesn't know what the job actually looks like." Sarah thought about the ER Bay 3, the morning handoffs, Lou's forearm, and the pediatric flag, and the woman in respiratory distress, and all the ordinary work that constituted the actual function of the building regardless of what was happening in the sub-basement. "Okay," she said. Okafor nodded once, professional and without ceremony. There will be a public statement from the board this week. It will address the Page matter, the federal investigation, and the steps being taken. Your name will be included. In what capacity? As the staff member whose documentation and actions contributed to the identification of the criminal operation. Okafor paused. The board wanted to phrase it differently, but I told them to be accurate. Sarah considered this. Accurate is fine. The public statement went out 4 days later. It was covered by 3 local news outlets and picked up nationally by 2 wire services and a healthcare industry publication. The coverage was factual and thorough and included, in most versions, the detail that the investigation had been significantly accelerated by an internal pharmacy report filed by a Callaway ER nurse 3 months before the federal case concluded, a report that had been suppressed by hospital administration and that the nurse had subsequently pursued through other means. Sarah read it once, in Harlow's diner, in the same corner booth where she'd been sitting when Garth walked in. Bree was working that morning, back from a brief leave that the diner's manager had apparently insisted on after the incident, a gesture of institutional care that Sarah found more thoughtful than most. And she brought the coffee without being asked and said nothing about the news, which was exactly right. The coffee was hot this time. Sarah drank it and looked at the repaired floor near the counter where the coffee pot had shattered, and thought about the specific arithmetic of that morning. The 8 minutes she'd sat in this booth before Garth walked in, the 38 seconds it had taken, the 90-minute head start Page had gotten before they caught up with him, the 3 months between a pharmacy report that went nowhere and a Tuesday that went everywhere. She thought about what Dre had said in the conference room at the field office. You think like someone who's been in situations where the information picture changes faster than the plan. She thought about what she'd said to Bree the morning after. That's different from not feeling it. She thought about all the things she'd been told, explicitly and implicitly, in the last 3 years and the years before. That she acted too independently, that her judgment bypassed protocol, that her skills were too much for the environment, that she wasn't the right fit, that brave enough was a quality someone else got to define for her. She thought about what it had cost her to carry all of that without putting it down. And she thought about how nobody had asked her to carry it, and how that was the thing about being dismissed. The institution never announced it. It just arranged the furniture so that you had less and less room to stand in, quietly, over time, until you were supposed to believe the arrangement was natural. She hadn't believed it. That was the whole of it in the end. Not the combat training, not the 2 deployments, not the citation in the shoebox. Just the specific stubbornness of someone who'd noticed something wrong and written it down and refused to accept that writing it down was enough. The kind of stubbornness that looks like recklessness to the people who benefit from the wrong thing going unnoticed. She left a tip that was more than the coffee cost, because Bree had gone back to work in a place where something bad had happened, and that deserved acknowledgement even if she'd never said so, and walked out into a morning that was colder than the last one, and brighter, and full of the particular quality of air that came after the first real frost of the season. She had a meeting at Callaway at 9. She had patience after that. She had work to do, the kind that mattered before anyone recognized it and would matter after the recognition faded, the kind that existed in the space between what institutions promised and what they actually delivered, the kind that fell to the people who understood that showing up was not the same as being seen, but that it was still, always, worth doing. She walked toward the hospital, not because it was easy, not because the building had earned her loyalty or the system had proven itself worthy of it, but because the patients inside it were real, and the problems inside it were real, and she was the person who knew where the door to the sub-basement was, and what lived inside and what it cost when nobody checked. Some people spent their whole careers being the loudest person in the room, certain that volume was the same thing as strength. Sarah Voss had learned, in 2 deployments and 3 years of night shifts and 1 morning in a diner where everyone else ducked, that the quietest person in a crisis was usually the one who already knew what they were going to do. She pushed through the hospital's main entrance, nodded to the security guard who'd worked the morning desk for as long as she could remember, and went to work.